The patient rounds of the last lamplighter. In a few streets of a few old cities, a cathedral close here, a royal park there, a crescent of houses that has successfully ignored 2 centuries of improvement, there still burn, every night, street lamps that run on gas. Not imitation gas, not electric bulbs got up in period costume, but the true, soft, breathing article, a mantle glowing in a glass lantern on an iron post, fed by the same public gas that warms the city's kettles. And where there are gas lamps there must be, in some form, the person who tends them, and so there survives, against every probability, one of the gentlest of all the lost professions, the lamplighter. There are only a handful left. This is the round of one of them, and it is best taken at his pace, which is the pace of a man who has never once been asked to hurry and would regard the request, if it came, as a category error. He begins in the late afternoon, in the yard of the works depot, with the checking of the kit, and the kit is a museum that happens to be in daily use. The ladder first, a wooden ladder, because wood is kind to the crossbars of old lamp posts and does not scratch 200-year-old paint, worn at the 6th and 7th rungs, which are the working rungs, pale as bone where 4 generations of boots have stood. Then the canvas bag, mantles in their little boxes, packed like eggs, spare glass, the soft brushes, the chamois leathers, the long brass pole with its hook and its key, for the lamps that can be reached without climbing, a spirit level of great age and no remaining accuracy, retained for luck, and the pocket watch, which is not for telling the time but for agreeing with the clockwork, as we shall see. He checks it all the way a sexton checks his keys, by touch, talking to the terrier that lives at the depot and attends the checking in a supervisory capacity, and then he sets out across the city as the light begins to go, a man with a ladder on his shoulder, walking through the rush hour in no particular hurry, which makes him, among the traffic and the phone-lit faces, either invisible or the most visible thing in the street, depending entirely on who is looking. His round is some 80 lamps, threaded through the old quarter, along the cathedral close, down the stepped lane behind the almshouses, through the churchyard where the plane trees drip long after the rain has stopped, around the crescent, and finishing, by a tradition he inherited and has never audited, at the lamp on the bridge. 80 lamps, each with its name in the ledger and its habits in his head. Because lamps, he will tell you, have habits. This one by the close gate runs bright, something generous in its governor. That one under the plane tree runs dim in October, when the leaves get at its air. The one at the foot of the steps is a martyr to spiders, who find its warmth in the small hours irresistible and curtain the lantern by morning. The one on the corner attracts, for reasons never established in a century of observation, an annual robin. He knows which glass panes are original, wavery, faintly green, precious, and which are sensible modern replacements. He knows which posts still bear the maker's name of a foundry that closed before the Great War, and which carry, low down, the deep grooves worn by the ladders of his predecessors, so that when he sets his own ladder in the groove it settles like a key into a lock cut for it long ago. Understand, before we light anything, what a gas lamp actually is, because the popular picture, a naked flame on a stick, undersells 2 centuries of refinement. The gas arrives up the hollow of the iron column from the main under the pavement, at a pressure so gentle it would barely trouble a soap bubble. At the top, inside the lantern, it passes through a governor to steady it, then to the burner, where it feeds not an open flame but a mantle, a little dome of fine ceramic mesh, delicate as moth wing, which the flame heats to incandescence so that the mantle itself, not the gas, gives the light. A mantle in good order turns a modest whisper of flame into that characteristic glow, warm, steady, slightly alive, the color of honey held up to a candle, that no lighting engineer, with any budget, has ever quite counterfeited in glass and filament. Above the burner, in the lamps of his round, sits the clockwork, a brass timepiece the size of a grapefruit, wound once a week, whose whole duty is to open the gas valve at dusk and close it at dawn. The clock does not know when dusk is, it must be told, and told again as the seasons swing, its dial nudged week by week, lighting a quarter hour earlier now, a quarter hour later then, so that all winter and all summer the lamps come on with the failing of the light and not by the calendar's crude reckoning. Keeping 80 lamp clocks in agreement with the turning year is the deep bookkeeping of the trade, and it is why his pocket watch matters, not to know the hour, but to catch a clock that has begun, in its old age, to dream. So the round is not really lighting, the clockwork does the lighting, these 100 years past, the round is tending. At each post he stops, and looks up first, always, the professional's upward glance, is the mantle hole, the glass sound, the flame, if the clock has already opened the valve, burning even and quiet? Then the ladder into its groove, the climb to the working rungs, the lantern door opened with the small key that is the actual badge of the profession, and the work of the evening, which is mostly the work of a careful housekeeper 30 feet spread across a city, the glass chamoised inside and out, the spiders evicted with apologies, the mantle inspected, never touched, a finger's touch is death to a mantle. The clockwork wound its dozen turns and its dial eased a notch against the season. The burner listened to. He can hear a fault before he can see it. A healthy lamp burns with a faint continuous sigh, like a sleeper who has found the right position, and a lamp with grit in its burner or age in its governor mutters, an irregular, fretful note that he treats exactly as a groom treats a hot fetlock, with unhurried attention now to prevent trouble later. Then the door is latched, the ladder shouldered, and on 30 yards of darkening pavement, to the next. Dusk overtakes the round about a third of the way through, and this is the passage of the evening he would not trade for any pension, the interval when the lamps begin to come on around him, one by one, each at its clock's own opinion of nightfall, so that the street lights itself gradually, like a theatre auditorium, a glow here, then two more behind him, then a little constellation down the crescent, the honey-coloured light pooling on the flagstones and climbing the brick, until the whole quarter has crossed over from day to evening by 100 small consents, and the commuters hurrying through it slow down, most of them, by some amount they do not notice. He has watched people enter the close at a march and leave it at a stroll for 40 years. He regards it as the trade's chief public service, more important than the light itself, which, he freely concedes, the electric could supply in greater quantity. Quantity, he will say, mounting the ladder, was never the point of light. It is worth remembering, while he climbs, what the world was like before this light, because the gas lamp was not an improvement on some earlier street light so much as an improvement on darkness itself. For most of the city's history, night in the streets was absolute, or worse than absolute, a dark stitched with menace and administered, if at all, by feeble parish oil lamps, little smoky wicks in glass boxes, lit reluctantly on moonless nights by contractors who watered the oil, and extinguished by midnight on the sensible grounds that respectable people were in bed. Those who had to travel hired the light they needed by the journey, the link boys, children with burning torches of pitched rope who walked ahead of the gentry for a coin and were, by reputation, as likely to lead a stranger into an alley of thieves as out of one. Then, 2 centuries ago, came the demonstration that changed every city on earth, a row of experimental gas lamps along a fashionable street, burning all evening, every evening, with a brightness and a steadiness no oil wick had ever managed, and the crowds came out simply to stand under them and look, as people will now travel to look at auroras. There were, it must be recorded, objections. Pamphleteers warned that lighting the streets all night would ruin morals by encouraging people to be abroad in them. Physicians debated whether so much artificial light might harm the constitution, and the link boys' trade, within a generation, was gone. But the gas mains crept street by street across the map like ivy, decade over decade, until the city glowed every night from river to hills, the first generation in the history of the species, it is worth saying slowly, for whom night in a public street was not, by default, black. Nobody now alive remembers the darkness that the lamps abolished. The lamplighter thinks of this, sometimes, at the top of the ladder, that his trade's great victory is so total it has become invisible, which is, he supposes, the only kind of victory worth winning. Where the gas itself comes from is a story the lamps have quietly outlived. For the first century and more of their reign, every city made its own light in the most literal way imaginable, at the gasworks, in the retort houses, where coal was baked, not burned, baked, sealed away from air in ranks of glowing iron vessels, until it surrendered its gas, which was washed, scrubbed, purified, and pushed out under the streets from those grandest of all vanished landmarks, the gas holders, the great iron drums, rising and falling with the city's breath, taller than churches, that stood at the edge of every town like docked moons. Children were taken to see them. The works had its own smell, its own railway, its own football team, the coke it produced warmed the town's grates, and the tar it produced paved the town's roads, so that the same black seam of coal lit the street, heated the parlor and surfaced the way home, an economy of almost suspicious tidiness. All gone now, of course, the works closed when the natural gas came in from under the sea, the retorts went cold, and the last holders were mostly taken down, mourned extravagantly by people who had never once been asked to smell them. But the mains survived. The pipes under the pavement are the oldest working infrastructure most streets possess, and the lamplighter is fond of pointing out, to anyone with the patience for the thought, that when he opens the little valve at the top of his ladder he is drawing on a network older than the post box, older than the railway's second act, older than the constitution of the country in its present form, the original public utility, still on duty, still at a pressure that would barely trouble a soap bubble. The profession he practices was once an army. In the high age of gas, every city in Europe and America had its corps of lamplighters, thousands strong in the great capitals, who went at dusk through every street with poles and ladders, lighting by hand, lamp by lamp, the entire illumination of the civilized world, and went round again at dawn to put it all out, like a tide of small stars advancing and withdrawing daily. They were the first public servants most children ever recognized. They knew every street's dogs and every parlor's habits. The poets were fond of them, and the police were fonder, a lamplighter's regular passage being worth a constable's, for who else looked down every area steps in the city twice a day? Their decline was not a defeat but a dissolve. The clockwork igniter arrived and the evening hand-lighting round became a weekly winding round, then the electric arrived, avenue by avenue, and the gas retreated to the quarters too crooked, too listed, or too loved to convert, and the army dwindled to platoons, and the platoons to this, a few men in a few cities, with wooden ladders and brass keys, tending the last of the tide. He is not melancholy about it. Nothing on the round is melancholy about it. The lamps burn on the public main and the ledger is funded and the waiting list of people who would like his job, should he ever conclude, runs to several hundred names. Rarity, he observes, suits the lamps. They were street furniture once. They are treasure now, and treasure gets looked after. He learned the round, as everything on the round is learned, from a man who had learned it the same way, 30 years his senior, called by everyone, including the ledger, simply the senior, who smoked a pipe at the foot of the ladder in defiance of every regulation and audited each of the boys' mantles from below with the naked eye at 40 feet. The apprenticeship was not quick. A year before he was allowed to change a mantle unsupervised, 2 before he was trusted with the clocks, because a clumsily wound lamp clock hoards its errors quietly and pays them out at dusk a fortnight later, when the senior would be standing, pipe glowing, under the one dark lamp in a lit street, waiting. He was taught the grooves, always the ladder in the groove is where the post is strongest. He was taught the weather law, wind from the east, check the close gate lamp, the draught gets under its door. he was taught the ethics of the trade, which the senior compressed into a single portable sentence: "The lamp doesn't know you're tired," and he was taught the depot's unwritten museum, the drawer of dead men's keys, each labeled, the mantle store with its boxes stacked like a pharmacy, some of the older stock from makers gone these 60 years, kept because they are still good and mantles do not spoil, the wall of round maps going back a century and a half, the same streets in fading inks. His own round traceable on the oldest map like a riverbed under a modern field. When the senior concluded, that was the word used, concluded, retirement being thought too abrupt a term for the trade, he handed over his key on the bridge, at the last lamp, without ceremony, saying only that the clocks would need a notch by Friday. It is the nearest thing the profession has to a coronation, and the lamplighter has already decided, though he has told nobody, which lamp he will hand his own key under, and roughly, very roughly, in which decade. The round keeps the seasons the way the lamps keep the dusk, by continuous small adjustment. In high summer the work is done in daylight almost to the end, the clocks eased later and later until the lamps barely light before 10, and the churchyard smells of cut grass, and the ladder's shadow reaches across the whole lane, the mantles last longest in summer, the glass stays cleanest, and the round becomes so nearly effortless that he invents work to preserve its length, on the principle, inherited, like the root, that a round done quickly is a round done once. But a round done slowly is done properly. Autumn brings the leaves into the lanterns and the spiders into everything, and the clocks begin their long march the other way, dusk gaining on the city minute by minute, the round starting earlier each week until, at the turn of the year, he is lighting into darkness at 3:30 and the lamps burn 16 hours at a stretch, the season of the mantle, when the delicate things are worked hardest and the bag carries double stock. Winter is chamois weather, breath fog on the glass, bare hands on brass because gloves and small keys are enemies, but winter is also the lamps at their most necessary and most beautiful, the honey light on snow being, by the consensus of every painter who has set up an easel on his round, the finest thing gas ever learned to do. And fog is the trade's ancient theatre. Electric light bounces off a fog and blinds, gaslight soaks into it and glows, each lamp becoming a soft golden sphere hanging in the grey, and on the 2 or 3 properly fogged evenings still granted each year, the round takes twice as long, partly because the flagstones vanish, mostly because he stops at every lamp to look, which the senior did too, and his senior before him, fog being the one weather in which the lamps outshine the century that replaced them. The round has its stations. At the almshouses, the wardens leave the gate on the latch for him, an arrangement older than anyone now party to it. In the churchyard, he lights, the one-hand-lit lamp of the round, kept manual by the church's own stubbornness, and he is glad of it, the pole raised, the key turned, the soft pop of the mantle catching, the light spreading up into the plain leaves, and the verger, locking up, says what the verger always says, evening, 1 more year, which began as a joke about something neither of them can remember and is now simply true. On the bridge, the last lamp of the round looks down the river at the floodlit face of the city, the electric city, splendid and even an instant, and the lamplighter, latching the little door, permits himself the trade's one nightly editorial. His lamp, he notes, is the only light in the view that anyone has touched today. The round has its public, too, beyond the wardens and the verger. The tourists find him nightly now, guided by the photograph sharing of strangers, and stand at a respectful distance filming the ladder and the little door as if he were unveiling a monument, which, he supposes, nightly, he has learned to work with an audience the way the cathedral's masons have, by pretending honestly not to notice. Painters come in autumn for the light and set up along the crescent, and he has appeared, small and ladder-shouldered, in more watercolors than any man since the profession's heyday. Film crews rent the clothes a few times a year, drawn by the one street where the 19th century can be photographed without scaffolding, and pay the diocese handsomely for darkness. his lamps turn briefly down, which he permits with the expression of a man lending his watch to a conjurer. And there are the children, who ask, always and only, the two great questions: what's up there? And can I look? And for whom he keeps, in the bag's side pocket, a burnt-out mantle in its box, moth-wing light and ghost white, to be held, carefully, cupped hands, while he explains that this small ruined thing lit a whole street for a season. The children hand it back with a gravity that entirely justifies the pocket. One of them, statistically, is the successor, several hundred adults on a waiting list notwithstanding. He suspects the trade will do what it has always done and choose early, quietly, by mantle light, without telling anyone for 30 years. There is one more instrument in the bag that has not been mentioned, because he uses it perhaps twice a year: the soap brush. A suspected leak on a lamp is found the old way, the only way worth trusting: soapy water painted along the joints, and then the watching, in the lamplight, for the slow blister of a bubble. No meter, however clever, has improved on a bubble, which announces the exact spot of the trouble, its size, and its urgency, all in one wobbling syllable. He was taught the soap brush in his first month and has taught it since to gas engineers a third his age, who arrive with electronic sniffers costing more than his van, and who go away, most of them, having quietly added a soap brush to their kit. The trade's tools do not become obsolete, he has noticed; they merely wait, at the bottom of the bag, for the future to circle back round to them. His predecessors, in the hand-lit age, walked the round twice, and the second walk, the dawn round, the putting out, was by every account the stranger and the lovelier of the two. The city at 5 in the morning belonged to a small and regular caste, the lamplighter with his pole, going lamp to lamp against the greying sky, the milkman, the market carts coming in with the smell of the country on them, the cats concluding their administrations, and the knocker-up, for this was the age of that other extinct trade, the human alarm clock, who went from contracted window to contracted window with a long cane, tapping the glass until the sleeper showed, and who was the old lamplighters like to say, the only person in the city with a round more punctual than theirs. The two trades would pass each other in the half-light with a nod, each extinguishing, in their way, the night. The modern round has no dawn walk, the brass clocks put the lamps out alone, in the order the daylight arrives, but the lamplighter has, once or twice a year and always without explaining it to himself, risen early and gone up to the close to watch it happen, the sky lifting, the lamps paling from honey to ghost, and then, one by one, each at its own clock's discretion, going out, not snapping off, but subsiding, the mantle's glow folding back into the grey of the morning so gradually that the exact moment of extinction cannot be fixed even by a professional at close range. It is, he maintains, the most peaceful mechanical event the city has to offer, and it plays nightly, morningly, to an audience of cats. The ledger records all of it, after its fashion. Back at the depot there is a shelf of them, the trade's entire memory in ruled faint: lamp 34, new mantle. Lamp 61, glass cracked, made safe, reglazed Thursday. Clocks eased 1 notch, all rounds. Fog, round long. The entries do not editorialize, the ledger has seen the gas defeated, restored, celebrated, listed and protected, and has maintained throughout the same tone of a book that expects to be consulted in a century and does not wish to embarrass itself. He writes his few lines each night by the depot's own gas bracket, kept in defiance of the electrician, on a main of its own, with the terrier supervising from the chair, and the entry he writes most nights, the entry the whole round rolls toward, is the trade's oldest and best sentence, for words, quite untranslatable into any grander idiom: all lit. All well. Then the ladder goes back on his shoulder, and he walks home through his own finished work, 80 soft lights burning behind him in the dark, each one wound, wiped, listen to and eased a notch against the turning of the earth, and at dawn, this is the part the city never sees, the 80 brass clocks will close their valves one by one, in the order the light comes back to the streets, and the lamps will go out gently, without a click or a flicker, the way a sleeper's breathing changes when the room begins to grow light, and the round will be waiting for him again at dusk, as it waited for the man before him and the man before that, patient as gas in a main, back down all the evenings to the first ladder in the first groove, and there are, he would want it recorded, few sounder foundations for a good night's sleep than a street lamp in good order, sighing faintly, burning at exactly the brightness it burned when your great-grandmother hurried home beneath it, holding the darkness not away, exactly, but at arm's length, courteously, until morning.